At the grand 35th birthday party for Mrs. Grace Wellington in Miami, her husband Kelvin made the worst mistake of his life by telling her that she is lucky he married her and she should be grateful she married a billionaire like him. He made the statement with microphone on his hand to the hearing of the distinguished guests. She divorced him at the spot and showed him who the boss is. She is actually an undercover billionaire who chose to lay low because of her humble beginning. Listen, I need to tell you about the most expensive birthday toast in Miami history. Picture this. Grace Wellington is celebrating her 35th birthday at a mansion in Coral Gables, surrounded by 300 of the city's most powerful people. Her billionaire husband Kelvin takes the microphone, and instead of saying, "Happy birthday, honey," he decides to remind everyone, and I mean everyone, just how lucky his wife is that he rescued her from the projects. But here's the thing nobody knew, not even Kelvin. Grace wasn't the one who needed rescuing. What happened next became the most viral divorce announcement in social media history. And trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Because sometimes the person you think you're saving is actually the one with all the power. Sometimes the grateful wife is secretly worth more than everyone in the room combined. Please show us support by subscribing to this channel. Your immense support helps us to bring you amazing stories every day. Now here is the story. Grace Wellington stood before her walk-in closet at 6 a.m., fingertips tracing the modest section she'd carved out among designer gowns she never wore. The simple black dress called to her, elegant but understated, the kind her grandmother would have approved of. Behind her, Kelvin's voice boomed through his morning conference call about quarterly projections and market dominance. 35 today, she whispered to her reflection, remembering another birthday decades ago when her mother had wrapped a single dollar store candle in a newspaper because it was all they had. That little girl from Liberty City would never have imagined standing in a Coral Gables mansion, married to one of Miami's most prominent developers. Yet somehow, that little girl felt more real than the woman staring back at her now. "Grace," Kelvin's voice cut through her reverie. "The caterers need to know about the champagne selection. Handle it." He didn't look up from his phone as he adjusted his Hermes tie, a tie that cost more than most people's monthly rent, though he'd never know that particular math. She nodded, swallowing words that had grown heavier over the years. 5 years of marriage, and she still felt like a guest in her own life. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had built an empire from nothing, now playing the grateful wife to a man who believed his wealth had rescued her from obscurity. Meanwhile, across town in his sleek Brickell Avenue office, Kelvin Wellington reviewed the guest list for his wife's party with the satisfaction of a chess master surveying his board. 300 of Miami's elite would witness his generosity tonight, his beautiful wife the perfect accessory to his success story. "She's lucky," he muttered to his assistant Marcus, "no Michael," scrolling through the catering invoice. $250,000 for a birthday party. Most women from her background never see this kind of money in a lifetime. His assistant shifted uncomfortably. In 5 years of working for Kelvin, he'd watched Grace transform from a radiant newlywed into something quieter, more careful. She'd been different in those early days, confident in a way that had nothing to do with money, with opinions about business that had surprised everyone with their sharpness. Now she mostly smiled and nodded, her intelligence hidden behind perfect party planning and charitable committee work. "Sir, Mrs. Wellington called about the champagne. Tell her to pick whatever. It's not like she's paying for it." Kelvin's laugh held an edge that made his assistant wince. "Sometimes I think she forgets how good she has it. From Liberty City to Coral Gables, that's the American dream right there." Back at the mansion, Grace hung up the phone and stared at the party preparations taking shape in their backyard. White tents stretched across manicured lawns, crystal chandeliers suspended like frozen stars. It was beautiful, undeniably, but it felt like a stage set for someone else's life. Her phone buzzed with a text from her financial advisor. R&D investment showing 340% returns. Your clean energy patents are revolutionary. When are you going public with the reveal? She typed back quickly. Not yet. Still deciding. The truth was more complicated than still deciding. She'd built her fortune quietly, methodically, using her maiden name and a web of carefully constructed LLCs. Renewable energy patents, tech investments, real estate acquisitions across 3 states, all invisible to a husband who saw her as his charitable project rather than his equal. She'd grown up watching her mother clean other people's houses, listening to employers dismiss her intelligence because of her zip code and her accent. When Grace's first patent had sold for 8 figures, she'd made a promise to herself. She would never be underestimated again. But somewhere along the way, she'd realized that hiding her success felt like another form of underestimation, this time self-imposed. Tonight felt different, though. 35 was the age her grandmother had always called the age of knowing. Old enough to understand yourself, young enough to do something about it. As the sun set over Biscayne Bay, painting the Miami skyline in shades of gold and possibility, Grace Wellington made a decision that would change everything. She was tired of being grateful for a life that was smaller than her dreams, tired of playing small so that others could feel big. She didn't know that across town, her husband was practicing a speech that would shatter their marriage in front of 300 witnesses. But perhaps some part of her sensed the storm coming, because for the first time in years, she chose the dress that made her feel powerful instead of appropriate. Have you ever found yourself diminishing your own light to make others comfortable around you? The Coral Gables mansion glittered like a jewel against the Miami night, its gardens transformed into an elegant wonderland of white silk and twinkling lights. Grace moved through the crowd of distinguished guests with practiced grace, accepting birthday wishes from judges, tech moguls, real estate titans, and socialites whose names graced hospital wings and museum plaques. "Grace, darling, you look absolutely radiant," cooed Victoria Ashford, wife of a prominent city councilman. 35 and still glowing. Kelvin is so generous to throw such an extravagant celebration. Grace's smile remained perfect, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Thank you, Victoria. Though I should mention, I actually planned most of this myself." "Oh, of course, dear. But the expense. You're so fortunate to have a husband who can afford such luxuries." The word fortunate landed like a small stone in still water, creating ripples Grace tried to ignore. She excused herself and moved toward the outdoor stage where a jazz quartet played softly, the kind of sophisticated background music that made conversations feel more important than they were. From across the terrace, she spotted her husband holding court near the champagne fountain, gesturing animatedly to a circle of business associates. Even from a distance, she could read his body language, chest puffed, chin raised, the stance of a man who owned everything in his sight line, including apparently her. At exactly 9:30 p.m., as planned, the jazz quartet finished their set, and the event coordinator handed Kelvin the wireless microphone. This was the moment for the traditional birthday toast, a sweet gesture Grace had watched play out at countless other couples' celebrations. Her heart actually lifted slightly as she watched him take the stage. Perhaps tonight he would remember the woman he'd fallen in love with, the one who'd challenged him during their first meeting at a charity auction, who'd debated urban development policy with him until 3 a.m. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kelvin's voice boomed across the suddenly quiet garden, "if I could have your attention for just a moment." Grace positioned herself near the front, smoothing her black dress nervously. Around her, Miami's elite turned expectant faces toward the stage, champagne glasses catching the light like tiny prisms. "Tonight we celebrate my beautiful wife Grace on her 35th birthday," Kelvin continued, his arm sweeping toward her with theatrical flourish. "And I have to say, looking at this incredible party, this stunning venue, these distinguished guests, it really makes me appreciate how far we've both come." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Grace felt heat creeping up her neck, some instinct warning her that this toast was about to veer into dangerous territory. You know, when I first met Grace 5 years ago, she was just a girl from Liberty City with big dreams and bigger ambitions. His voice carried that particular tone she'd learned to dread, the one he used when telling their love story at dinner parties, always casting himself as the benevolent prince. And look at her now. Look at this life she gets to live. The crowd was smiling, nodding, but Grace felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Several guests turned to beam at her, their expressions radiating that familiar mixture of admiration and subtle condescension she'd endured for years. Let's be honest, Kelvin continued, his voice growing more confident, more performative. Grace hit the lottery when she married me. I mean, from the projects to Coral Gables? That doesn't happen every day, folks. A few uncomfortable chuckles scattered through the audience. Grace's hands clenched at her sides, her perfect smile beginning to crack at the edges. So tonight, as we celebrate this beautiful woman who has graced my life, pun intended, more forced laughter, I want her to remember just how lucky she is. Grace, sweetheart, you should be grateful every single day that you married a billionaire like me. Not every girl from the hood gets to live like a queen. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 people stood frozen, champagne glasses halfway to lips, the weight of Kelvin's words settling over the party like a toxic cloud. Grace felt every eye in the garden boring her, felt the pity and secondhand embarrassment radiating from guests who suddenly found their shoes fascinating. The jazz quartet had stopped tuning their instruments. Even the catering staff had gone still. But what Grace felt most acutely was the sound of something breaking inside her chest. Not her heart, exactly, but something deeper. The last fragile thread of pretense that had held her smaller self together for 5 years. She looked up at her husband, still standing on the stage with that microphone in his hand and that satisfied smile on his face, completely oblivious to the bomb he'd just detonated. He actually winked at her, as if he'd just delivered the most romantic toast in history. In that crystalline moment, Grace Wellington, hidden billionaire, secret mogul, quiet revolutionary, made a choice that would echo through both their lives forever. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Kelvin," she said, loud enough for every guest to hear, her tone carrying a strength that seemed to surprise even her. "Could you please keep that microphone on for just one more minute? I think our guests deserve to hear the rest of this story." The crowd held its collective breath as something magnificent and terrible began to unfold before their eyes. The silence stretched like a taut wire across the elegant terrace. Kelvin's confident smile flickered as he registered something in his wife's voice he'd never heard before, something that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the warm Miami night. "Grace, honey," he said into the microphone, his tone suddenly cautious, "I think everyone's ready for dancing now. Maybe we should." "No." The single word cut through his sentence with surgical precision. Grace took another step forward, her movements fluid and deliberate. "I said keep the microphone on, Kelvin." 300 guests shifted like a single organism, sensing the electricity in the air. Victoria Ashford clutched her husband's arm. The mayor's wife fumbled for her phone, torn between recording and fleeing. Even the valet attendants had stopped what they were doing, drawn by the magnetic pull of impending drama. Kelvin's laugh came out forced, brittle. "Sweetheart, you're being dramatic. Everyone knows I was just. Everyone knows you were just humiliating your wife in front of Miami's most prominent citizens," Grace interrupted, her voice carrying across the garden without needing amplification. "But what everyone doesn't know is that you just humiliated the wrong woman." "Grace." Kelvin's voice dropped to a stage whisper, but the microphone caught every syllable. "Stop this. You're embarrassing yourself." The irony of his words hung in the air like smoke. Judge Martinez, standing near the fountain, actually winced. Grace smiled then, and it was nothing like the careful, practiced smile she'd worn for 5 years. This smile had teeth. Embarrassing myself? Kelvin, darling, I haven't even started. Look, everyone. Kelvin turned to address the crowd, his salesman instincts kicking in. My wife's had a bit too much champagne. You know how emotional women get on their birthdays. Emotional? Grace's laugh was like breaking a crystal. Oh, Kelvin, you have no idea what emotion looks like. She began walking toward the stage, each step measured and purposeful. The crowd parted before her like water, guests unconsciously creating a path while pretending they weren't staring. The clicking of her heels on the stone terrace provided a rhythmic countdown to something everyone could feel building, but no one could name. Grace, get down from there, Kelvin hissed as she climbed the 3 steps to the stage. You're making a scene. I'm making a scene? She stood beside him now, close enough that the microphone picked up her words perfectly. You just told 300 people that your wife should be grateful you rescued her from poverty. You called our marriage an act of charity. On live microphone. At my birthday party. And I'm making a scene? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several people nodded almost involuntarily. The optics were becoming unavoidably clear, even to those who'd initially been prepared to write off Grace's reaction as feminine hysteria. Kelvin's face was beginning to flush. I was celebrating your success story. Our success story. The American dream. No, Grace said quietly, but her voice carried like thunder. You were telling everyone here that you own me. That I'm your charity project. Your pet rescue. That's not. You're twisting my words. Am I? Grace turned to face the crowd, her posture regal despite the chaos swirling around them. Did everyone else hear something different? Because what I heard was my husband telling 300 witnesses that I should be grateful he deigned to marry beneath his station. The crowd was no longer pretending not to watch. Phones were emerging from purses and jacket pockets. This was no longer a private marital spat. This was a public reckoning, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be discussed in Miami social circles for years. Grace, please. Kelvin's voice took on a pleading quality that only made him sound more desperate. Let's discuss this privately. Like adults. Like adults. Grace's voice rose for the first time, and the raw pain in it made several women in the crowd actually step forward instinctively. Adults discuss things together, Kelvin. Adults don't blindside their spouses with public humiliation disguised as romance. She reached for the microphone, and for a moment they both held it. The brief tug-of-war was captured by dozens of phones, the image of a marriage literally being pulled apart in real time. Give me the microphone, Kelvin. Grace, I'm warning you. Warning me? Her voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. What exactly are you warning me about? What do you think you can do to me? Something in her tone made Kelvin's grip on the microphone loosen. Not because he chose to let go, but because some primitive part of his brain recognized that he was no longer dealing with the compliant woman he thought he'd married. Grace took the microphone with steady hands, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm, controlled, and absolutely lethal. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to what was supposed to be a celebration. But sometimes truth has terrible timing. She paused, her eyes finding her husband's face. Kelvin, you wanted to tell everyone about luck and gratitude, and who should be thankful for what. Well, darling, I think it's time we told them the whole story. Kelvin went very still beside her, something in her tone finally penetrating his arrogance. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely afraid. Grace, he whispered, don't. But Grace Wellington, secret billionaire, hidden mogul, woman who had spent 5 years playing small, was done with don't. Grace held the microphone like a sword, her thumb poised over the power button. The entire garden had become a living theater, 300 people frozen in a tableau of anticipation and dread. Even the Miami breeze seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was holding its breath. You know what, Kelvin? Grace said, her voice carrying a deadly calm. I've changed my mind. She clicked off the microphone and handed it to a stunned sound technician who had materialized beside the stage. The sudden absence of amplification felt like a vacuum, drawing everyone closer as they strained to hear what would happen next. This conversation doesn't belong to them, she continued, gesturing toward the crowd. This belongs to us. Kelvin's relief was palpable, his shoulders sagging as he misinterpreted her restraint as capitulation. Thank God. Grace, we can work this out. We always do. Just, let's get through tonight, and tomorrow we'll... Oh, we're going to work this out tonight, Grace said, stepping down from the stage. Right now. But not here. She began walking toward the house, her stride purposeful and unwavering. After a moment of confused hesitation, Kelvin followed, his own steps less certain. The crowd watched them go, a sea of faces reflecting everything from disappointment at the anticlimactic end to relief that they wouldn't be witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. Should we? Victoria Ashford whispered to her husband, gesturing vaguely toward the house. Absolutely not, Judge Martinez muttered, taking a large gulp of champagne. Whatever's about to happen in there, we don't want to be part of it. Inside the mansion, Grace led them to Kelvin's home office, a room designed to intimidate, all dark wood and leather, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. His degrees hung on the walls like trophies, alongside photos of him with mayors, governors, and celebrities. It was his sanctuary, his throne room, the place where he felt most powerful. Grace closed the door behind them and turned the lock with a decisive click. Grace, let's be reasonable here, Kelvin began, moving behind his massive desk as if the furniture could protect him from whatever storm was brewing. I know my toast wasn't perfect. Maybe I could have phrased things better. Phrase things better? Grace's laugh was hollow. Kelvin, you told 300 people that I'm your charity case. That I should be grateful you rescued me from the projects. That I hit the lottery when I married you. But that's true, isn't it? The words escaped before he could stop them, revealing the depth of his genuine bewilderment. I mean, financially speaking, your life is objectively better. Stop talking. Grace's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. Just stop. She moved to the windows, staring out at the glittering Miami skyline. The lights of downtown reflected off Biscayne Bay like scattered diamonds, beautiful and distant. For a long moment, the only sound was the muffled music and laughter drifting in from the party they'd abandoned. Do you know what the worst part is? Grace said finally, her back still turned to him. It's not that you think those things. It's that you said them into a microphone, in front of everyone we know on my birthday, and you thought I'd smile and nod and say thank you. Kelvin shifted uncomfortably. I thought you'd understand that I was celebrating with you. Our journey together. Our journey? Grace turned to face him, and something in her expression made him take an involuntary step backward. Kelvin, what do you actually know about my journey? I know you grew up in Liberty City. I know your mother cleaned houses. I know you worked your way through college, got your MBA. And then what? And then you met me at the charity auction, and we fell in love, and then I quit my job to be your wife. Yes. He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. And what job was that, Kelvin? What exactly did I quit to marry you? For the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain. You worked for some consulting firm. Something with sustainability. Grace stared at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was filled with something that might have been pity. I was the founder and CEO of Wellington Sustainable Solutions. I had 43 employees and contracts with 6 Fortune 500 companies. My patents for solar panel efficiency were being courted by Tesla and Apple. Kelvin's face went blank. You never told me you owned the company. I told you on our second date. I showed you the patent applications on our third. I invited you to the office on our fourth. Her voice remained steady, factual. You listened to exactly none of it because you'd already decided who I was based on where I grew up. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, they could hear the party continuing. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses, a celebration proceeding without its guest of honor. Grace, Kelvin said slowly, even if that's all true, it doesn't change the fact that my net worth is. Is what, Kelvin? Grace moved closer to the desk, her eyes never leaving his face. What exactly do you think your net worth is compared to mine? Something in her tone made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. Kelvin loosened his tie, suddenly feeling claustrophobic in his own office. This is ridiculous, he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. You're upset, you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 5 years. Grace placed her hands on his desk, leaning forward slightly. The question is, are you ready to hear what I'm thinking about? Grace moved to Kelvin's filing cabinet and withdrew a thick manila folder he'd never seen before. The sight of it, official, purposeful, clearly prepared in advance, sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. You want to talk about net worth? Grace said, placing the folder on his desk with deliberate precision. Let's talk about net worth. She opened the folder, revealing documents that looked like they belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than a domestic argument. Financial statements, patent registrations, LLC formations, investment portfolios, all bearing a name that made Kelvin's mouth go dry. G.M. Williams, he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace Michelle Williams. My maiden name, which I kept for business purposes while you were too busy feeling magnanimous to notice. She pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. This is my primary investment portfolio. As of market close today, it's valued at $2.8 billion. Kelvin stared at the number, blinking as if it might rearrange itself into something more manageable. This has to be fake. Some kind of joke. Page 2 shows my renewable energy patents. Tesla licensed 3 of them last month for $340 million. She flipped through the documents like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Page 4 is my real estate holdings. 18 properties across Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Page 6 shows my stake in 4 different tech startups, all of which have gone public in the last 2 years. Each revelation hit Kelvin like a physical blow. His hands shook as he tried to process numbers that dwarfed his own considerable wealth by a factor of 3. But how? When? I would have known. You would have known if you'd ever asked me a single meaningful question about my work. Grace's voice remained steady, clinical. But you were so charmed by your own narrative, successful billionaire saves girl from the hood, that you never bothered to look deeper. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her posture relaxed now that the truth was finally in the open. Do you want to know the real story, Kelvin? The one you never let me tell. He nodded mutely, still staring at the financial documents spread across his desk like evidence of his own willful blindness. I was 7 years old when my mother lost her job cleaning office buildings downtown. The company said they were downsizing, but really they just hired an undocumented crew for half the wages. Grace's voice took on a distant quality, as if she were reading from someone else's memory. We had 3 days to come up with rent money or face eviction. Grace. I watched my mother cry for the first and only time in my life that night. Not because we might be homeless, but because she felt like she'd failed me. This brilliant, hard-working woman who spoke 3 languages and had a degree from Haiti that nobody in America would recognize. She felt like a failure because she couldn't make the math work. Kelvin shifted uncomfortably, beginning to understand that this story wasn't going where he'd expected. That night, I promised myself 2 things. I would never let anyone make my mother feel small again, and I would build something so big, so solid, that no one could ever take it away from us. Grace smiled, but it was edged with steel. I was 8 when I started buying broken electronics from garage sales, and reselling them after fixing them. 12 when I got my first patent for a solar cell efficiency improvement. 16 when I incorporated my first company. But you never said. I said plenty. You just heard what you wanted to hear. She pulled out another document, a copy of a college newspaper article from 15 years ago. The headline read, "Local Teens Solar Innovation Wins National Competition." The photo showed a younger Grace holding a trophy, her smile radiant with possibility. I was named to Forbes 30 Under 30 list when I was 24. I was featured in Fortune magazine when I was 27. My TED Talk on sustainable energy has 3 million views. She tapped each achievement with her finger. But somehow, you managed to miss all of that. Kelvin's face had gone ashen. Why didn't you correct me? All these years, why did you let me think? Because I loved you, Grace said simply, and the past tense hung in the air like a tolling bell. Because when we met, you seemed different from other men who'd been intimidated by my success. You talked to me about urban development, about creating opportunities in underserved communities. I thought you saw me. She stood and moved back to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. I thought if I made myself smaller, if I stepped back from the spotlight, we could build something real together. I thought love meant making space for your ego by shrinking my own achievements. Grace, do you know what the cruelest irony is? She turned back to face him, and for the first time he saw tears in her eyes. You fell in love with my intelligence, my drive, my vision for changing the world. And then you spent 5 years trying to convince me I should be grateful you'd settled for someone beneath your station. The weight of her words settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Outside, the party continued, oblivious to the fact that everything the host and hostess had built together was disintegrating behind locked doors. I can fix this, Kelvin said desperately. We can fix this. I'll make an announcement. I'll tell everyone. Tell everyone what? That you've been married to a billionaire for 5 years and never bothered to notice? That your wife's net worth makes your fortune look like pocket change, but you were too busy feeling superior to pay attention. Grace moved toward the door, her hand resting on the lock. There's something else you should know, Kelvin. Something that makes tonight's performance particularly illuminating. Have you ever realized that your assumptions about someone revealed more about you than about them? Grace's hand remained on the door lock, but she didn't turn it. Instead, she leaned against the heavy wood, suddenly looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. The charity auction where we met, she said quietly. Do you remember what I was bidding on? Kelvin's mind raced back 5 years, trying to reconstruct that night through the lens of everything he'd just learned. The scholarship fund, for kids from low-income families to attend STEM programs. I wasn't just bidding on it, Kelvin. I found it. Grace's voice was soft now, stripped of the steel it had carried moments before. The Grace Williams Foundation for Educational Equity. I'd already donated $12 million by the time we met that night. She moved away from the door, settling into the leather chair across from his desk again. For the first time since they'd entered the office, she looked vulnerable rather than victorious. I watched you bid against me that night, driving the price higher and higher, and I thought. She paused, a ghost of a smile crossing her face. I thought, finally, someone who cares about these kids as much as I do. Kelvin's throat felt raw. You let me win. I let you think you won. The foundation got the money either way, yours and mine combined. She picked up one of the financial documents, not really looking at it. But that moment when you came over to congratulate me on making such a strong showing for a good cause, you were so genuinely proud of me for caring about something bigger than myself. Nobody had looked at me like that in years. Like what? Like I was good. Not smart, not successful, not profitable, just good. Her voice caught slightly. Most men were intimidated by my money or trying to figure out how to get access to it. But you seem to see something else. Kelvin remembered that night differently now, the memory reshaping itself like film developing in a darkroom. He'd been impressed by her passion, her articulate arguments about educational inequality, the way she'd made him think about his own privilege in ways that challenged rather than threatened him. "You were different then," Grace continued. "We stayed up until 3 in the morning talking about systemic poverty, about how to create real change instead of just writing checks. You listened to my ideas about sustainable development in underserved communities like they mattered. They did matter. They do matter. When?" The question was gentle but devastating. "When was the last time you asked me about my work? When was the last time you treated my opinions as anything more than cute observations from your pretty wife?" Kelvin opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of years of conversations that had never happened. "I kept thinking you'd notice," Grace said. "When I had to take calls from patent lawyers, when investment firms wanted meetings, when Forbes wanted to do a follow-up interview. I kept thinking you'd get curious about why your wife from the projects had so many high-powered business contacts. I thought they were related to charity work. They were. All of it was. The business, the patents, the investments. It was all about building something that could create real change." She leaned forward, and for a moment, her eyes held the same fire he'd fallen in love with 5 years ago. "Do you know what my latest project is?" He shook his head. "Affordable housing development in Liberty City. Not gentrification, actual affordable housing that lets families stay in their communities while having access to better resources. I've been working on it for 3 years." Her voice grew stronger, more animated. "Solar-powered units, community gardens, job training programs, a partnership with Miami-Dade schools for after-school STEM education." Despite everything, Kelvin found himself leaning forward, caught up in her enthusiasm. This was the woman he'd married, brilliant, passionate, world-changing. "The groundbreaking is next month," Grace continued. 150 units, with a community center that will serve the whole neighborhood. "It's going to be beautiful, Kelvin. It's going to matter. Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "Why didn't you include me?" Grace's expression softened, and for a moment, the anger gave way to something that looked like grief. "I tried. Remember when I mentioned I was working on a development project in my old neighborhood? You said it was sweet that I wanted to give back to my roots, and then you changed the subject to your downtown hotel project." The memory hit him like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his own achievements, so certain that his projects were the important ones, that he'd dismissed hers as hobby charity work. "I thought if I kept being patient, if I kept trying to show you who I really was, eventually you'd see me." Her voice was thick with unshed tears now. "But instead, you saw what you wanted to see, a grateful wife who'd been rescued from poverty. And the more you saw me that way, the more I started to disappear, even from myself. Grace, the saddest part is that I think you really did love me. The real me. But you loved the idea of saving me more." She stood up, moving toward the window again. "And I loved you enough to let myself be saved, even though I was never drowning in the first place." Outside, the party was winding down. Guests were beginning to drift toward the valet station, their voices carrying across the water like distant music. Soon, the house would be empty except for the two of them and the ruins of everything they'd built together. The silence in the office stretched like a held breath until it was broken by a soft knock on the door. Michael, Kelvin's assistant, cleared his throat nervously from the hallway. "Mr. Wellington? I'm sorry to interrupt, but the guests are asking when you'll be returning to the party. And there are some photographers outside the gate." Grace and Kelvin looked at each other, the spell of their fragile moment shattered by the reminder of the world beyond these walls. The reality of what had happened, what was still happening, came crashing back like a cold wave. "Tell them we'll be out shortly," Kelvin called, his voice strained. "Actually," Grace said, loud enough for Michael to hear, Tell them the party's over. Thank everyone for coming and seeing that they get to their cars safely. Grace, we can't just... Can't what? She turned from the window, and the vulnerability he'd glimpsed moments before was gone, replaced by something harder, more final. Can't acknowledge that you humiliated me in front of 300 people. Can't admit that our marriage just imploded on live social media. As if summoned by her words, Kelvin's phone began buzzing incessantly on the desk. Notification after notification lit up the screen, tagged photos, video clips, messages from friends and colleagues who'd witnessed his catastrophic toast. Grace glanced at the phone, then back at him. How many of those do you think are people offering their condolences to the poor girl who got put in her place by her generous husband? That's not, people don't think. Don't they? Grace moved to his computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced efficiency. The screen filled with social media feeds, and Kelvin's stomach dropped as he saw video after video of his toast being shared, commented on, dissected. The comments were a mix of horror and glee, people choosing sides in a drama they only half understood. Some defended Grace, calling Kelvin's words cruel and demeaning. Others praised his honesty about the realities of their relationship. But all of them, every single one, treated Grace like a supporting character in Kelvin's story, rather than a person with her own agency. Look at this one, Grace said, her voice deadly calm as she read from the screen. Finally, someone brave enough to say what we're all thinking about these gold-digger marriages. Or this one. She should be grateful. Not every man would wife up a project girl, no matter how pretty. Kelvin felt sick. Grace, those people don't know you. But they know exactly what you think of me, don't they? Because you told them. With a microphone. At my birthday party. She closed the laptop with a sharp snap. Do you understand what you've done? You've turned our marriage into a meme. You've made me a cautionary tale about knowing your place. I can fix this, Kelvin said desperately, moving around the desk toward her. I'll post something, clarify what I meant. What did you mean, Kelvin? The question stopped him cold. Because from where I'm standing, you meant exactly what you said. You think you rescued me. You think I should be grateful. You think my worth is measured by your generosity. That's not. Then explain it to me. Grace's voice rose for the first time since they'd entered the office. Explain how telling 300 people that I hit the lottery by marrying you was actually a compliment. Explain how suggesting I should be grateful every day for your billionaire status was meant to honor me. Kelvin's mouth opened and closed uselessly, because the truth was, in that moment on stage, basking in the admiration of Miami's elite, he had felt generous. He had felt magnanimous. He had felt like a man who'd given a deserving woman the life she could never have achieved on her own. You can't, Grace said quietly, reading his silence. Because we both know what you meant. And more importantly, we both know you meant it. She moved past him toward the door, and panic flared in his chest. Where are you going? I'm going to pack. Her hand was on the doorknob now. I'm going to take some clothes and leave this house tonight. Grace, please, we can work through this. Marriage is about forgiveness. Forgiveness? She turned back to him, and the look in her eyes was nothing he'd ever seen before. Kelvin, do you think this is about forgiveness? Do you think this is about one bad toast on one bad night? Isn't it? Her laugh was hollow, broken. This is about 5 years of you never seeing me. 5 years of me shrinking myself down to fit into your story about who I should be. 5 years of pretending that your love for me wasn't conditional on my gratitude. My love isn't conditional. Really? Then why did you marry me? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Not the version of me you've created in your head. Not the grateful project girl you rescued from poverty. Me. The actual me. Why did you marry Grace Williams? Kelvin stared at her, his mind scrambling for an answer that wouldn't destroy them both. But every response that came to him proved her point. He'd married her because she was beautiful and smart and different from the women in his social circle. He'd married her because saving her made him feel noble. He'd married her because her gratitude made him feel powerful. He'd never married her because she was his equal. "You can't answer," Grace said softly, "because you never married me at all. You married a fantasy, a project, a story you could tell about your own goodness." She opened the door, and the sounds of the dying party drifted in. Caterers cleaning up, cars driving away, the end of an evening that had changed everything. "Goodbye, Kelvin." "Grace, wait." But she was already gone, leaving him alone in his office with the scattered evidence of a woman he'd never truly known and a marriage that had just died in front of 300 witnesses. Grace stood in the master bedroom they'd shared for 5 years, staring at the walk-in closet that had become a monument to her own self-erasure. Designer gowns Kelvin had bought for charity gala hung like ghosts beside the simple dresses she actually preferred. Jewelry worth more than most people's houses sat untouched in velvet-lined boxes, while her grandmother's pearl earrings, the ones she'd worn on their wedding day, lay forgotten in a small dish on her nightstand. She pulled out a single suitcase, the same one she'd used for business trips back when she was still traveling for Wellington Sustainable Solutions. Back when she was still herself. Her phone buzzed constantly, messages from friends who'd been at the party, reporters who'd somehow gotten her number, business associates who'd seen the videos online. She turned it face down and focused on packing, each item a decision about who she wanted to be when she walked out of this house. The simple black dress from her closet went in first. Then the pearl earrings. Her laptop, containing 5 years' worth of business plans she'd never shared with her husband. The folder of documents about the Liberty City housing project, her real birthday gift to herself. Downstairs, she could hear Kelvin pacing in his office, his voice rising and falling as he made phone calls. Damage control, probably. Crisis management. All the skills that made him successful in business, applied to the wreckage of their marriage. As if summoned by her thoughts, his footsteps appeared in the doorway. "Grace." His voice was hoarse, broken. "Please, don't do this." She didn't look up from her packing. "Do what, Kelvin? Leave? Or finally stop pretending?" "Both." "Neither." "I don't know." He entered the room hesitantly, like a man approaching a dangerous animal. "I've been thinking about what you said, about why I married you. And I married you because you made me want to be better." The words came out in a rush, desperate and raw. "Because when you talked about changing the world, I believed you could actually do it. Because you were the smartest person I'd ever met, and you chose me anyway." Grace's hands stilled on the suitcase. "I chose you anyway? That's not what I meant." "Yes, it is." She finally looked at him, and he saw tears in her eyes for the first time all evening. "That's exactly what you meant. Even now, even knowing everything you know, you still think I chose you when I chose you." "Grace, do you want to know why I really married you?" She sat heavily on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking exhausted. "Because you were the first man who seemed to love my ambition instead of being threatened by it. Because when I told you about my plans to revolutionize sustainable housing, you didn't tell me to be realistic. You asked how you could help." Kelvin moved closer, hope flickering in his chest. "I still want to help. With the Liberty City project, with all of it." "No, you don't." Grace's voice was gentle but final. "You want to help the version of me that fits into your story. The grateful wife who would be honored to have your assistance with her little charity project." "That's not true, isn't it? 5 minutes ago, you found out your wife is worth nearly $3 billion, and your first instinct was to figure out how to manage the PR disaster. Not to apologize for never noticing. Not to ask about my work or my dreams or what I've been building while you weren't paying attention. You wanted to control the narrative." The accusation hit him like a physical blow because it was absolutely true. Even now, part of his mind was calculating how to spin this, how to emerge from the wreckage with his reputation intact. "I can change," he said quietly. "I can learn to see you." The real you. Grace smiled then, and it was the saddest thing he'd ever seen. Oh, Kelvin, you can't learn to see someone you've been looking at for 5 years. You can only learn to see what you want to see. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the bay where lights from downtown Miami twinkled like fallen stars. Do you know what the worst part of tonight was? It wasn't the humiliation. It wasn't even the cruel words. What was it? It was the look on your face when you said them. You were so proud of yourself. So generous. You genuinely thought you were giving me a gift by publicly acknowledging how lucky I am to be your wife. Kelvin sank into the chair by the window, the weight of his own blindness crushing him. I thought I was celebrating with us. You were celebrating you, the wonderful, magnanimous man who married beneath his station and elevated a poor girl to paradise. Grace turned back to her packing. But I was never beneath you, Kelvin. I was beside you, and you never once looked sideways to see me there. I'm looking now. No, you're not. You're looking at a problem to be solved, a crisis to be managed, a wife to be convinced to stay. She zipped the suitcase with finality. But you're still not seeing Grace. Then show me, he said desperately. Show me who Grace is. Grace picked up her suitcase and walked to the bedroom door. For a moment she paused, her hand on the frame, and looked back at the man she'd loved for 5 years. Grace is the woman who's going to walk out that door tonight and never look back, she said quietly. Grace is the woman who's going to finish the Liberty City project without your help or your money or your name attached to it. Grace is the woman who's going to stop apologizing for taking up space in her own life. She took a step into the hallway, then stopped again. And Grace is the woman who's going to file for divorce in the morning, because she finally remembered that she's worth more than gratitude. With that, she walked away, leaving Kelvin alone with the choice he'd been too blind to realize he was making every day for 5 years, to see her or to lose her. By the time he understood the choice, it was already too late. 3 months later, the Liberty City Community Center buzzed with excitement as Grace stood before a crowd of families, local officials, and media representatives. Behind her, construction crews put the finishing touches on the first phase of the Wellington Williams Sustainable Housing Development, a name that honored both her business identity and her grandmother's maiden name, with no reference to the marriage that had ended in such spectacular fashion. When I was 7 years old, Grace began, her voice carrying easily across the crowd without need for amplification, my mother and I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment 6 blocks from here. We had big dreams and small resources, but we had something more important than either. We had hope. The crowd was rapt, hanging on every word. Among them sat families who would be moving into the new units within the month, children who would attend the after-school STEM programs, teenagers who would have access to job training and college preparation resources. Today, we're not just breaking ground on new housing. We're breaking cycles. We're proving that sustainable development and community empowerment can exist together. We're showing the world that people don't need to be saved. They need to be seen, supported, and given the tools to save themselves. The applause was thunderous, genuine, filled with the kind of hope that changes neighborhoods and lives. Grace smiled, feeling more like herself than she had in years. After the ceremony, as she mingled with residents and community leaders, her assistant approached with a tablet. Ms. Williams, there's been another interview request. This one's from Forbes. They want to do a cover story on your emergence as one of the most influential hidden philanthropists in the country. Grace glanced at the screen, then back at the families exploring their future homes. Set it up. But make sure they understand, this isn't about me coming out of hiding. This is about showing people what's possible when you build something real instead of just building wealth. As the crowd began to disperse, Grace noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the construction site. Kelvin looked different, smaller somehow, less certain. He'd lost weight, and there was something in his posture that suggested the confident swagger she'd known for 5 years, had been replaced by something more hesitant, more human. He approached slowly, like a man walking toward his own judgment. "Grace." "Kelvin." Her voice was neutral, neither warm nor cold. "I didn't expect to see you here. I saw the news coverage. About the project." He gestured toward the new buildings, genuine admiration in his voice. "It's incredible. Everything you said it would be. Thank you." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened between them settling in the warm Miami air. "I wanted to apologize," Kelvin said finally. "Not just for that night, but for all of it. For 5 years of not seeing you." Grace studied his face, looking for traces of the man who had humiliated her in front of 300 people. What she saw instead was someone who looked genuinely broken down and rebuilt. Not the Kelvin who had married her, but perhaps someone who could have been worth marrying. "I know," she said simply. "I've been going to therapy, trying to understand how I could have been so blind to who you really are." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she remembered from their early days together. "My therapist says I have something called savior complex, that I was more invested in being your rescuer than in being your partner. What do you think?" "I think she's right. I think I loved the idea of loving you more than I actually loved you." The admission seemed to cost him something significant. "And I think you deserved so much better than that." Grace nodded slowly. "I did. But more importantly, I knew I did. I just forgot for a while. The divorce papers were fair. More than fair." He looked down at his feet. "I didn't contest anything because honestly, you were right about everything. About the money, about my assumptions, about what our marriage really was. I'm glad you understand that now." "Grace." He looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, not just regret, but genuine respect. "Is there any chance, any possibility, that we could start over? Not as who we were, but as who we are now?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they should cross. Grace looked around at the community center, at the families still exploring their new neighborhood, at the tangible proof of what she could build when she stopped making herself smaller. "Do you know what I've learned these past 3 months?" she asked. "What?" "I've learned that love isn't about gratitude. It's not about rescue or salvation, or being generous enough to marry someone beneath your station." She turned to face him fully. "Love is about seeing someone exactly as they are and choosing them anyway. Not because you can save them, but because they're already whole." Kelvin nodded, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "I've also learned that I don't need to be loved by someone who sees me as a project to be completed or a story to be told about their own goodness." Grace's voice was steady, sure. "I need to be loved by someone who sees me as an equal, as a partner, as someone whose dreams are just as important as their own." "I could be that person," Kelvin said quietly. "I could learn to be that person." Grace smiled, and it was kind but final. "I believe you could. But Kelvin, I'm not going to teach you how to love me properly. I'm not going to shrink myself down again while you figure out how to see me as I really am." The rejection hit him, but he accepted it with more grace than she'd expected. "I understand," he said. "And for what it's worth, watching you these past 3 months, seeing what you've built, who you've become when you're not trying to fit into my idea of who you should be, I finally see her. Grace. The real Grace. And she's extraordinary." "She always was," Grace said gently. "You just had to be willing to look." As Kelvin walked away, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years, complete peace with her own choices. She was building something beautiful, something meaningful, something that would outlast any marriage or heartbreak. She was finally fully herself. Her phone buzzed with a message from her project manager. "Next phase of development approved. When do we break ground on the school?" Grace smiled, typing back, "Tomorrow. We start tomorrow." Because that's what Grace Williams did. She built tomorrows, one foundation at a time. What dreams have you been waiting for permission to pursue? And what would happen if you gave yourself that permission today?